My name is Amanda Richardson. I am 32 years old. Last Friday, my father sat me down at his dining room table and told me I had 7 days to pay a $310,000 debt, or I was no longer part of the family. He told me the debt belonged to my younger sister, but that I was going to liquidate my savings to cover it, because blood requires sacrifice. I looked at my father, then at my mother, who was busy rearranging an untouched slice of roast beef just to avoid making eye contact with me. I stood up and said, "Then I am not." I drove 2 hours back to Syracuse that night, logged into my financial accounts, and moved every cent I owned into a new bank before the clock struck midnight. 30 days later, their corporate attorney handed me a document demanding my signature to save the family business. I read the collateral section, smiled, and pointed to one specific property they had secretly pledged. Before I tell you exactly what I found in that document, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Elderly Stories so you never miss a conclusion. Drop your age in the comments below. I really want to know what stage of life you are navigating while listening to this. Now let me take you back to that Friday night. My father Thomas does not invite people to dinner just to catch up. He summons them. He built a regional logistics company from the ground up, and he runs his household with the exact same unyielding metrics. You either produce value or you are a liability. Growing up, the roles were assigned early. I was the reliable one. I paid my own way through Binghamton University, earned my degree in finance, and became a senior analyst by the time I was 28. My younger sister Vanessa was the exception to his rules. Vanessa received seed money, a luxury vehicle, and endless grace. 3 years ago, Thomas funded her high-end wellness spa. I warned him the margins were unsustainable. He told me to stop being jealous. When I pulled into their driveway that evening, I expected a lecture about my lack of attendance at recent family events. Instead, I walked into an ambush. The dining room table was set, but no one was eating. Thomas sat at the head. Vanessa sat to his right, dabbing her eyes with a linen napkin. "Susan." My mother stared intently at her plate. "Sit down," Thomas said. He did not say hello. I took the chair opposite Vanessa. My father leaned forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany wood. He outlined the situation with the cold precision of a quarterly earnings report. Vanessa's spa was failing. The vendors were demanding payment. The commercial lease was months in arrears. The total deficit was $310,000. I listened to the numbers. As an analyst, my brain immediately calculated the damage. That was roughly 5 years of my net savings. Every dollar I had carefully invested, every bonus I had, banked, stripped away to plug a hole in a sinking ship. "That is a terrible situation," I said. "What is her restructuring plan?" Thomas did not blink. "You are her plan, Amanda. You have the liquidity. You are going to clear the accounts by next Friday." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. There was none. He was serious. He was dictating a 6-figure requisition of my own money. "I am not paying her business debts," I said. My voice stayed level. "I do not shout in negotiations." Thomas tightened his jaw. His face turned a shade of pale red. "You will do this, or you are no longer family. You will be cut off. We will not know you." The room went dead silent. The refrigerator hummed from the kitchen. I looked at Vanessa. She stopped crying and watched me, expecting me to cave. I looked at Susan. My mother just kept pushing that cold piece of roast beef around her china plate, refusing to intervene, silently endorsing the extortion. The ultimatum hung in the air: pay the ransom or lose my parents. I realized in that fraction of a second that if my membership in this family cost $310,000, it was a terrible investment. I pushed my chair back. It scraped loud against the hardwood. I stood up, looked my father right in the eyes, and said, "Then I am not." I walked out the front door, got into my car, and drove the 2 hours north to Syracuse in the dark. I did not cry. I calculated. By 11 o'clock that night, I was sitting at my own kitchen table with my laptop open. I opened new accounts at an entirely different banking institution. I transferred my checking, my savings, and my emergency fund. I changed my passwords, updated my security questions, and locked down my credit. The 7-day deadline had just started, but I had already made my decision. I just did not know yet that my refusal was about to uncover a much deeper crime. Saturday morning arrived with bright sunlight and a quiet phone. I woke up at 6, made a pot of black coffee, and set my phone face up on the kitchen counter. I expected a deluge of notifications. Voicemails from my father demanding respect, pleading texts from my mother, guilt trips from extended relatives who had been drafted into the war. Instead, the screen remained dark. The silence was thick and deliberate. If you do not know Thomas Richardson, you might think the silence meant he was cooling off. I knew better. My father built his regional logistics company by outlasting his opponents. When a vendor disputed an invoice, he stopped taking their calls. When his dispatchers threatened a strike 6 years ago, he locked the doors and let them sit in the freezing rain for 2 days without a word of negotiation. He starves his adversaries of contact to induce panic. He waits for the anxiety to build until you crack, pick up the phone, and agree to his terms just to end the tension. He was treating me like a striking dispatcher. He assumed I was sitting in my Syracuse apartment pacing the floor, terrified of losing my family. He was wrong. I was not pacing, I was auditing. I carried my coffee to my home office, booted up my dual monitors, and initiated a forensic review of my own identity. My father demanded $310,000. He stated it like an invoice that was already due. Thomas Richardson does not guess at figures. If he told me the deficit was exactly $310,000, it meant he had been staring at the ledgers. And if he was staring at Vanessa's ledgers, he was already looking for a lifeline. I needed to make sure he had not already used mine. I requested my official reports from Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. I pulled my check systems file to ensure no hidden checking accounts existed in my name. I navigated to the Onondaga County and Cortland County property registries, running searches on my social security number, my full legal name, and variations of my signature. My keyboard clicked in the quiet apartment. Line by line, I reviewed my trade lines, my auto loan, my student lines of credit which I had closed years ago, my 2 primary credit cards, my mortgage on the 2-bedroom condo I bought 3 years ago. Everything showed a status of paid as agreed. No delinquent accounts, no unauthorized personal loans, no mysterious credit cards registered to a post office box in my parents' town. My phone buzzed against the desk, vibrating hard against the wood. I glanced down. It was a text message from Vanessa. "I know you will do the right thing for us, Mandy. We love you." I stared at the glowing text bubble. The phrasing was a masterclass in entitlement. She did not apologize for the debt. She did not ask for a favor. She used the word us, binding her personal financial failure to the survival of the entire family. She used the childhood nickname Mandy, a name I had not gone by since middle school, to artificially inject warmth into an extortion attempt. She genuinely believed her high-end spa, a vanity project that burned through cash on imported eucalyptus and imported marble, was a shared burden. I did not type a response. I did not block her. I simply swiped the notification away and returned to my monitors. The deadline was ticking, and I was not going to waste calories arguing with a sister who viewed my bank account as her personal overdraft protection. I continued combing through the Experian data. I moved past the active accounts and down into the inquiries section. Hard inquiries occur when you actively apply for credit. Soft inquiries happen during background checks, pre-approvals, or account reviews. They do not affect your score, so most people ignore them. I do not ignore data. There were the usual soft pulls: my auto insurance provider checking my risk profile, a promotional credit card offer. Then my eyes locked onto a line item dated 4 months prior. Empire State Commercial Bank. I stopped scrolling. I leaned closer to the screen. Empire State Commercial Bank is a regional lender that specializes in mid-market corporate debt and commercial real estate. They do not issue consumer credit cards. They do not underwrite standard residential mortgages. I had never stepped foot in their branches. I had never inquired about their services. Why would a commercial lending institution pull the personal credit profile of a retail financial analyst living in Syracuse? It was a minor anomaly, a blip in the data. To anyone else, it would mean nothing. To me, it represented a loose thread. 4 months ago, Vanessa's spa would have been bleeding cash. 4 months ago, Thomas would have been scrambling to secure a bridge loan to keep his favorite daughter afloat. A commercial bank does not run a soft check on an individual unless that individual is listed somewhere in a corporate application file as a guarantor, an executive, or a collateral holder. I had not signed anything. I had not authorized my name to be used. Yet there it was, a digital footprint proving my father was using my identity in rooms I was not invited into. I picked up a legal pad and wrote down the name of the bank and the exact date of the inquiry. I needed to figure out what Thomas was pledging to that bank. I needed to know what piece of paper had triggered that algorithm. I was deep in a property records database when the silence of the weekend shattered again. This time it was a phone call. The caller ID displayed the name Carol Richardson. Aunt Carol is my father's older sister. We had not spoken in 2 years. 5 years ago, Carol questioned the accounting methods Thomas used to handle their late mother's estate. Thomas responded by cutting her out of the family entirely. He banned her from Thanksgiving, instructed my mother to return her Christmas cards unopened, and waged a quiet war to ensure she was isolated from the rest of the relatives. Carol calling me was not a social check-in. It was a breach of protocol. I answered on the second ring. "Hello, Aunt Carol." "Amanda." Her voice was breathless, tight with an anxiety I had never heard from her before. She sounded like she was hiding in a closet. "Are you okay? Are you safe in your apartment?" I frowned, pushing my chair back from the desk. "I am fine. I am sitting at my computer. Why are you asking me that?" "Because your father has been calling everyone," Carol said. Her words rushed out, spilling over each other. "He called me. He called your Uncle David. He called the Millers down the street from their house. He is telling everyone you are having a breakdown, Amanda." I felt the temperature in the room drop. A breakdown. "Yes," Carol continued, her voice trembling slightly. "He said you showed up to dinner on Friday night, acting erratic. He said you started screaming about money, that you are under severe psychiatric distress, and that the family is trying to get you placed in a facility for your own safety." I stared at the notepad on my desk. The name of the commercial bank was written in sharp black ink. The strategy materialized in front of me. Thomas was not just starving me out. He was burning the ground around me. "He is telling them not to answer your calls," Carol whispered. "He said you might lash out, that you are suffering from paranoid delusions regarding your finances." "Amanda, what is happening? What did you do to him?" I did not scream. I did not cry. I recognized the tactic. If you are going to forge documents or steal from someone, the smartest thing you can do is convince the world your victim is crazy before they ever have a chance to report the crime. "Thank you for telling me, Carol," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "I am perfectly healthy. But Thomas is about to have a very bad month." I hung up the phone. The quiet weekend was officially over. My father was spinning a web to discredit me, but he had no idea I had just found the thread that would unravel his entire empire. I reached for my keyboard, opened a new tab, and typed the name of my accounting firm's human resources director. I had to secure my career before my father's narrative reached my boss. After hanging up the phone with Aunt Carol, I walked into my kitchen to pour a second cup of coffee. My eyes drifted to the drying rack sitting next to the stainless steel sink. Resting there was a custom ceramic coffee mug. The painted letters across the front read, "Best Sister." Vanessa bought it for me 4 years ago. She handed it to me, wrapped in expensive tissue paper, right before asking if I would co-sign the commercial lease for her first apartment in Manhattan. I declined the lease, but I kept the mug. I used to look at it while washing dishes and pretend the sentiment behind the gift was real. I picked it up by the handle. The ceramic felt heavy and cold. My father was currently dialing every relative in our family tree, diagnosing me with a psychiatric crisis to protect his own reputation. He was using the social fabric of our extended family as a weapon, wrapping a neat little narrative around my sudden disappearance so no one would ask awkward questions about missing funds. Vanessa knew exactly what he was doing. She stayed quiet, fully content to let my reputation burn to ashes as long as her debts disappeared. I held the mug over the trash bin and let go. It hit the bottom with a dull, satisfying crack, shattering into a dozen useless pieces. The fake bond was gone. Now it was just business. The weekend passed in a state of high alert. By Monday morning, I was sitting at my desk in the Syracuse office of the accounting firm where I worked as a senior financial analyst. The environment there was built on discretion, fiduciary duty, and trust. We handled high net worth individuals and corporate tax strategy. Reputation was everything. At 9:15, my office door opened. Gregory, the managing partner of the firm, stood in the doorway. He is a man who measures his words carefully, avoiding corporate drama at all costs. Today, he looked distinctly uncomfortable. He closed the door behind him and took a seat across from my desk. He folded his hands and cleared his throat. "Amanda," he began, his tone cautious. "I received a very unusual voicemail on my private line yesterday. It was from your father." I felt the air leave my lungs, but I kept my posture straight. Thomas had crossed the invisible line. He was no longer just poisoning the well at family reunions. He was aiming directly at my livelihood. Gregory continued explaining that Thomas left a 3-minute message playing the role of a devastated, loving parent. Thomas told my boss that I was experiencing a severe psychological episode. He claimed I was making erratic, dangerous financial decisions and suggested the firm temporarily suspend my access to client accounts for my own protection. He framed it as a medical emergency. He wanted them to bench me. He wanted to cut off my income stream so I would be forced to crawl back to his dining room table and surrender my savings. Most people would crumble in that chair. They would cry, apologize, and try to explain the complex, toxic history of their family dynamic. I did not do any of that. I looked Gregory in the eye and gave him facts. I told him my father was attempting to extort a 6-figure sum from me to cover my sister's failing business. I explained that I refused to pay the ransom, and in retaliation, my father was launching a coordinated defamation campaign to destroy my professional credibility. Gregory listened. His uncomfortable expression shifted into cold professional understanding. An executive attempting to sabotage his own daughter's career to cover insolvency is a risk profile a financial firm understands perfectly. I did not stop there. I stood up, walked directly down the hall, and entered the Human Resources Department. I sat down with the director and filed a formal preemptive report. I documented the extortion attempt. I provided a written statement verifying my mental competence and financial stability. I instructed our legal department to draft a cease and desist letter addressed to Thomas, keeping it ready to fire if he contacted the firm again. Finally, I gave building security a photograph of my father and specific instructions that he was never to be permitted past the lobby. I built a fortress around my career by treating my father not as a parent, but as a hostile corporate entity. I drove home that evening with a clear mind. My job was secure, but the soft credit inquiry from Empire State Commercial Bank still gnawed at my analytical instincts. After dinner, I powered up my home workstation. I needed to understand the architecture of my father's panic. Thomas ran Richardson Regional Logistics with an iron grip. He owned a fleet of long-haul trucks and a lucrative warehouse facility. He always bragged about his untouchable cash flow. Why was he shaking me down for Vanessa's spa debts? Why did he not just write her a check and handle the deficit himself? I navigated to the New York Department of State Corporation and Business Entity Database. I paid the nominal fees to access the detailed records. I searched for Richardson Regional Logistics. Then I searched for Vanessa's company, Lotus Wellness. I spent 2 hours cross-referencing the filings looking for the intersection point. Then I found the Uniform Commercial Code portal. These filings are public records that creditors use to establish their legal right to seize assets if a debtor defaults. I ran a search on my father's business name. The results populated, and the screen told a story Thomas had spent the last 2 years hiding. 3 months ago, Empire State Commercial Bank filed a financing statement against Richardson Regional Logistics. It was a staggering commercial lien. My father had leveraged his entire trucking fleet, his warehouse equipment, and his accounts receivable. I traced the debtor strings. The funds were not used to buy new trucks. They were funneled directly into a holding company. I ran the holding company's tax identification number. It matched the parent corporation of Vanessa's spa. Thomas had secretly cross-collateralized his life's work to float her luxury wellness business. And it was failing anyway. The spa was drowning, dragging the logistics firm down with it. That explained his true desperation. He did not just need $310,000 to save Vanessa. He needed my money to stop the commercial bank from seizing his trucks and destroying his empire. But that still did not explain why the bank ran a soft inquiry on my personal credit file. My name was not on the logistics paperwork. My name was not on the spa paperwork. I leaned back in my desk chair, staring at the glowing monitor. There was one piece of the puzzle missing. A commercial lender does not snoop on a retail analyst unless that analyst holds title to something the bank desperately wants. The quiet hum of my computer fan filled the room. The 7-day deadline my father gave me had just expired. I was sitting there wondering what his next move would be when a sharp, heavy knock sounded at my front door. The knock on my door was sharp and authoritative. It did not sound like a neighbor or a delivery person. It sounded like the rhythm of someone who expected to be answered immediately. I stood up from my desk, leaving the financial charts open on my monitors, and walked slowly to the entryway. I checked the peephole. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stood on the welcome mat, clutching a thick leather portfolio. He did not look like a process server from a local magistrate. He looked like an emissary from a world of high stakes and high fees. I unlocked the door and stepped back. The man gave me a thin, practiced smile. He introduced himself as a representative of a Manhattan courier service. He informed me that the package I was about to receive was time-sensitive, legally privileged, and required proof of receipt. He pulled a digital pad from his jacket and pushed it toward me with a stylus. The screen prompted me for a signature. I stared at the plastic tip of the stylus. My father always played the long game. Sending a courier was his way of reclaiming the narrative of power. He wanted me to feel the weight of this encounter. He wanted to remind me that he operated in a sphere of professionals while I was just a daughter who was supposed to be hiding in her apartment waiting for his mercy. I signed the pad. The man handed me the envelope. It was thick, heavy, and embossed with the silver seal of Sterling and Associates, a firm known in legal circles for managing the portfolios of the ultra-wealthy and the dangerously insolvent. The courier stepped back, nodded once, and turned to walk toward the elevator. The sound of his footsteps retreating down the hallway felt like the end of an era. I carried the envelope to my kitchen island, using a letter opener to slice through the heavy bond paper. My heart rate remained steady. I had spent my career analyzing complex financial instruments. I was not intimidated by legal stationery, no matter how many billable hours it represented. I pulled the contents out. The cover letter was addressed to me, Amanda Richardson, in a formal, aggressive typeface. It was signed by Julian Sterling, a partner I had heard of in the news for his work in high-stakes corporate restructuring. The document requested my presence at a mandatory legal meeting to finalize a corporate restructuring plan for Richardson Regional Logistics. The tone was patronizingly polite. It framed the situation as a dire necessity to prevent the immediate collapse of the business. According to the letter, Thomas Richardson was facing a liquidity crisis that threatened the livelihoods of 50 hardworking employees. It suggested that my signature on a series of attached documents was the final prerequisite to stabilize the firm and restructure the debt obligations. I sat down and began reading the dense legal jargon. The letter was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. It emphasized the history of the company, the pride of my father's legacy, and the tragic consequences for the staff if this restructuring failed. It was designed to trigger guilt. It was structured to make me feel like the villain for even contemplating a refusal. If I did not sign, 50 families would potentially lose their income, and the legacy of my father's life work would dissolve into bankruptcy proceedings. It was a classic trap. They were weaponizing their own failure, placing the moral weight of their bankruptcy on my shoulders, as if I were the one who had mismanaged the accounts. I finished the last page and took a long sip of cold coffee. My father knew I was an analyst. He knew I valued the welfare of employees and the integrity of corporate operations. He assumed I would read the guilt trip, see the threat of job losses, and rush to sign anything to avoid being the reason a dozen families lost their insurance. He underestimated my capacity for detachment. I was not going to walk into a room blind. I was not going to sign a single line before I understood the legal architecture of this request. I pulled out my phone and drafted an email to Julian Sterling. My message was short, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. I acknowledged receipt of the package and stated that I was reviewing the materials. I added that before any meeting could be scheduled, I required a digital copy of the entire restructuring agreement, including the exhibits and the collateral schedules, sent to my secure email address by the end of the business day. I pressed send, feeling a sense of deep, focused calm. I spent the next 6 hours working on a project for my firm, but the courier's arrival stayed in the back of my mind. At 5:45, a notification pinged on my laptop. A secure link had arrived from Sterling & Associates. I opened the file. The document was a 60-page PDF containing the full restructuring plan, the debt service schedules, and the updated asset valuations for the company. I scrolled through the pages, analyzing the tables and the executive summaries. I was looking for the reason why the bank had run a soft inquiry on my credit report. I was looking for the intersection between my personal identity and the corporate balance sheet. I reached the section labeled Exhibit B, the Asset Collateral Schedule. This section listed every piece of property, every account, and every asset that had been pledged to the commercial bank as security for the new loan. My eyes moved down the list of warehouse facilities and logistics equipment. Then I hit the bottom of the page. I stopped. The line item described a property located on the shores of Skaneateles Lake. It listed a parcel number that I recognized immediately. I had spent every summer of my childhood running across that dock, climbing the oak trees in the backyard, and painting the shutters of the porch with my grandmother. My heart did not race, but the air in the room felt suddenly thin. My father had pledged my grandmother's lake house as collateral for the restructuring, but that property was never his. It was mine. My grandmother's estate had settled years ago, and she had been explicit in her will. That property was to be held in a trust for me until I reached the age of 30. Thomas had no legal standing to pledge that land as collateral for a commercial loan. He was attempting to use my inheritance to bail out my sister's failing spa. I leaned back, staring at the screen. The trap was now visible. My father needed me to sign a document that would effectively waive my ownership rights to the lake house. If I signed it, I would be legally consenting to the bank seizing my property to pay for Vanessa's debts. If I refused, he would go to the bank and say he didn't own the property, which would immediately trigger a default on the loan, likely leading to a federal fraud investigation. He was walking a tightrope of deception, and he needed me to be the anchor that would keep him from falling. He assumed I would be too sentimental to check the collateral schedules. He thought I would be too intimidated by the high-powered law firm to ask questions. He thought I would prioritize the appearance of family unity over the reality of my own financial future. He was wrong. The game had shifted from a private dispute to a public document. I was no longer an analyst dealing with my father. I was an owner dealing with a thief. I saved the file to a secure encrypted drive and began drafting the next phase of my strategy. The feeling of anger that had been simmering since the dinner was gone replaced by a cold, sharp, surgical resolve. I knew exactly what I was going to do next, and it was going to be the most expensive mistake my father had ever made in his life. I stared at the glowing monitor. The 60-page document from Julian Sterling was designed to exhaust the reader. Corporate lawyers build fortresses out of paper, hoping the opposition surrenders before reaching the core. I did not surrender. I scrolled past the dense indemnification clauses, the complex amortization schedules, and the generic corporate resolutions. I analyzed the text with the cold, methodical focus of a senior auditor. I stopped at Exhibit B. The header read, Asset Collateral Schedule. The list detailed the physical security backing the new commercial loan. There were the expected items: flatbed trucks, staging warehouses, logistics equipment, and accounts receivable belonging to my father's business. Then I reached the bottom of the page. Line item 42 described a residential property located on the eastern shore of Skaneateles Lake. It listed a distinct parcel identification number. I raised my hand, extending my index finger, and traced the sequence of numbers across the glass screen. The digital digits blurred as my mind pulled me backward in time. That parcel was not just a line item on a corporate balance sheet. It was a sprawling cedar-shingled retreat built in the late 1970s. It smelled like fresh pine and damp earth. I spent my childhood summers on that property. I remembered standing on the wraparound deck holding a dripping brush painting the wooden porch rails beside my grandmother Evelyn. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and told me stories about building a foundation that could withstand any storm. Evelyn was a sharp, observant woman. She loved her son, my father, but she never trusted his ambition. She recognized early on that Thomas viewed relationships as transactions and people as leverage. She watched him spoil Vanessa, funding every whim while expecting me to manage my own survival. When Evelyn drafted her estate plans, she acted with profound foresight. She did not leave the Skaneateles property to him. She left it to me. The title was placed into an irrevocable trust. The legal structure was specifically designed to bypass my father and transfer the property to my name exclusively upon my 30th birthday. That milestone occurred 2 years ago. Thomas possessed zero legal claim to the dirt, the structure, or the equity. Yet here it was, listed on a legal document drafted by a top-tier Manhattan law firm, acting as the bedrock security for a commercial loan designed to rescue Vanessa's sinking spa. As a financial analyst, my brain dissected the mechanics of the crime. When a corporate entity seeks a high-value capital injection, the lender requires security. Banks use strict loan-to-value ratios. A wellness spa is a high-risk venture. It has depreciating assets, leased equipment, and unpredictable cash flow. Empire State Commercial Bank would have demanded hard real estate-backed collateral equal to or greater than the funding amount. Vanessa's spa held zero hard assets. The logistics company was already highly leveraged. My father needed something pristine to pledge. He reached into a portfolio he did not own. He presented the lake house to the commercial underwriters as family property. The easiest way to delay discovery in loan misrepresentation is by feeding the bank just enough paperwork to pass the initial review. A busy underwriter processing a bridge loan might accept a sworn affidavit of ownership or an outdated preliminary estate summary if the borrower is a well-known regional executive like Thomas Richardson. It is a calculated risk. Thomas took that risk assuming the loan would be repaid before the bank ever dug into the county archives to verify the deed. But Vanessa's luxury spa failed to generate revenue. The monthly loan payments lagged. The commercial bank initiated a deeper risk assessment. They ran a soft inquiry on my credit report because my name was tied to the true title. The truth surfaced. Someone in the underwriting department finally pulled the updated county property records and found the discrepancy. They saw the irrevocable trust. They realized their security was built on a mirage. The bank would have called Thomas and demanded an immediate cure for the title defect. They would have threatened an instant default and potential federal charges for bank fraud if the collateral was not properly secured. The sheer arrogance of the Friday night dinner came into agonizing focus. My father did not ask me for help that night. He issued an ultimatum threatening to banish me from the family if I did not hand over $310,000 in cash. He tried to bully me into liquidating my savings because he desperately wanted to pay off the commercial loan before the bank escalated the title defect. When I stood up, refused the demand, and walked out, his timeline collapsed. The bank demanded a valid signature to cure the defect, forcing him to hire Julian Sterling to draft the corporate restructuring facade. That was the true purpose of the 60-page document sitting on my hard drive. Thomas did not need me to save 50 innocent employees. He did not need me to protect his corporate legacy. He needed me to sign a quitclaim deed buried deep within the legal jargon. I scrolled back up to page 47 of the PDF. There it was, tucked beneath a section titled Waiver of Exemption. It was a release of interest form. A quitclaim deed transfers any interest the grantor has in the property to a grantee. It offers no warranties. It is a quiet, seamless way to erase ownership. If I applied my signature to that specific page, Julian Sterling would file it with the county clerk in Syracuse the very next morning. The bank would be satisfied. Thomas would be off the hook for bank fraud. Vanessa would keep her eucalyptus towels. I would retroactively authorize the pledge. I would surrender my inheritance to cover his federal crime. I would legally tether my grandmother's sanctuary to my sister's failure. He assumed I would be too sentimental to check the collateral schedules. He thought I would be too intimidated by the expensive law firm to ask questions. He believed the threat of ruining the family business would force me to sign the paperwork without reading the fine print. He was trying to trick me into giving away a highly valuable waterfront estate. The phrase corporate restructuring was camouflage. The document was a surrender flag. The anger I felt earlier in the week vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp surgical resolve. I was no longer an estranged daughter dealing with a demanding parent. I was a property owner dealing with a thief. I could not simply refuse the meeting. If I ignored the courier, Thomas would find another way to forge the documents or manipulate the narrative. I needed to trap him in a room where his lies could be documented on the record. To do that, I needed the original paper trail. I needed the foundational proof that Thomas knew exactly what he was doing when he defrauded the commercial bank. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and unlocked the screen. I opened my contacts list and scrolled down to the letter M. I tapped the name David Miller, the senior estate attorney who had managed my grandmother's irrevocable trust a decade ago. I listened to the line ring, ready to gather the arsenal that would dismantle my father's empire. I scheduled an appointment with David Miller for Tuesday morning. His practice was located in a historic brick building in downtown Syracuse. David had managed my grandmother's affairs for 3 decades. He was not a flashy corporate litigator like Julian Sterling. He was a meticulous gray-haired practitioner of estate law who operated in a world of quiet certainties and ironclad trusts. When I walked into his office, the scent of aged paper and polished oak grounded my thoughts. I sat across from his broad desk, placing my encrypted laptop on the leather blotter. I explained the sequence of events without filtering the details. I described the Friday night dinner, the absurd financial demand, the soft credit pull from the commercial lender, and the 60-page restructuring file delivered by courier. I opened my laptop and showed him the asset schedule, identifying the Skaneateles parcel. David adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He did not express shock. Estate attorneys rarely display surprise. Instead, he stood up, walked to a heavy steel filing cabinet in the corner of his office, and unlocked a secure drawer. He extracted a thick manila folder labeled with Amanda Richardson's name. Returning to his desk, he pulled out a heavy stock watermarked instrument binding. He slid it across the smooth wood toward me. "That is the original certified copy of the irrevocable trust," David stated. "Your grandmother established this instrument 12 years ago. She appointed me as the managing trustee until you reached the age of 30. At that milestone, the title transferred exclusively to your name." David tapped a weathered finger against the signature line. "Evelyn was a very perceptive woman, Amanda. She loved her son, but she saw right through him. She sat in that exact chair you are sitting in now and told me Thomas viewed every asset as a poker chip. She explicitly constructed this trust to ensure the lake house could never be leveraged, mortgaged, or sold to fund his speculative ventures. She knew he could not be trusted with generational stability. I traced the embossed seal on the paper. The tactile reality of the document carried immense weight. It was the armor my grandmother had forged to protect my future. I asked David to confirm the current chain of title. He logged into the county registry portal on his terminal, typing the parcel identification sequence. The screen populated with the official municipal records. The data was undeniable. I was the sole legal owner. Thomas possessed zero equity, zero claim, and zero authority over the land. We reviewed the timeline of my father's commercial loan. The financing statement was filed 3 months ago. To secure a loan of that magnitude, a borrower must present a sworn declaration of ownership regarding the pledged collateral. How did he get past the commercial underwriters, I asked. David steepled his fingers, his expression darkening into a frown. He explained the likely mechanics of the deception. When Evelyn passed away, Thomas served as the executor for her remaining liquid assets and minor personal effects. During that process, he gained access to earlier preliminary drafts of her will. Before Evelyn finalized the irrevocable trust, she had drafted a standard will that temporarily listed Thomas as the primary heir to her entire estate. She later revoked that draft and superseded it with the trust protecting the real estate. Thomas kept a copy of that outdated revoked will. When Empire State Commercial Bank demanded security for Vanessa's failing spa, Thomas handed them the obsolete paperwork. He signed an affidavit swearing it was the current and accurate reflection of the estate. The underwriters accepted the fraudulent filing at face value to expedite the lucrative commercial transaction. Everything snapped into sharp focus. The pieces aligned perfectly. The bank approved the bridge loan based on false pretenses. The funds were dispersed, keeping Vanessa's vanity project breathing for a few more months. Then the spa defaulted on its payment schedule. The bank initiated a rigorous audit of the collateral to prepare for asset seizure. During that intensive review, a diligent clerk pulled the actual county deed and discovered the irrevocable trust. The bank realized their security was worthless. They confronted Thomas, threatening to call the entire loan due and report him to federal authorities for bank fraud. My father was backed into a corner of his own making. He was not asking me for a favor. He was not demanding family loyalty. He was desperately trying to stay out of a federal courtroom. He needed my signature on that quitclaim deed to retroactively validate his lie. If I signed the restructuring packet, I would surrender my inheritance and officially adopt his fraudulent pledge as my own legitimate decision. I sat in the quiet office, letting the gravity of the situation settle over me. A cold wave of clarity washed away any lingering familial guilt. For my entire life, Thomas conditioned me to believe my role was to absorb the consequences of his favoritism. He built an entire narrative portraying me as the difficult, uncooperative daughter to mask his own financial recklessness. He launched a smear campaign attacking my mental health and attempting to sabotage my career, all to force me into compliance before I could uncover his felony. The audacity was breathtaking. He was willing to destroy my professional reputation and steal my inheritance just to shield Vanessa from the consequences of her own failed business. David watched me process the information. He offered to draft a formal cease and desist order immediately. He suggested we contact the commercial lender directly to notify them of the fraudulent pledge. He even offered to attend the meeting with Julian Sterling to represent my interests. I raised my hand, declining his offers. If we tipped our hand now, Thomas would pivot. He would find another scapegoat or attempt to forge my signature on the quitclaim deed. I needed to trap him in a controlled environment where his deception could be exposed on the record in front of a licensed corporate attorney who was bound by ethical reporting standards. I needed Julian Sterling to realize he was being used to facilitate a crime. I asked David to provide me with 3 notarized certified copies of the trust alongside the official county stamps verifying my singular ownership. I placed the heavy stack of verified proof into my leather portfolio. I thanked David for his time and his unwavering loyalty to my grandmother's wishes. Walking out of his office and stepping onto the busy Syracuse sidewalk, I pulled out my phone. I opened the email chain with Sterling and Associates. I typed a brief, courteous response. I confirmed I had reviewed the corporate restructuring file. I agreed to attend the mandatory meeting at their Manhattan office on Friday morning at 10 o'clock. I did not mention bringing legal counsel. I did not ask any further questions regarding the collateral schedule. I crafted the message to project the image of a submissive, intimidated daughter who was finally ready to fall in line and sign whatever was necessary to save the family name. I hit send. The trap was set. My father thought I was walking into the lion's den entirely unarmed. He had no idea I was bringing the cage. My preparation was finished, but the true test of endurance was waiting for me in a glass-walled conference room. I had 48 hours until the meeting in Manhattan. Most people facing a high-powered corporate attorney and a hostile family would spend that time panicking. They would seek constant reassurance from friends, or they would stay up late drafting emotional speeches they would never actually deliver. I am a senior financial analyst. I process betrayal and anxiety through rigorous organization. My dining room table transformed into a war room. I cleared away the ceramic centerpieces and laid out my arsenal. Spreadsheets, printed emails, digital property records, and the newly acquired copies of the trust instrument covered the polished wood surface. I approached the impending confrontation not as a daughter attending a family intervention, but as an investigator preparing for a hostile deposition. I needed redundant, unimpeachable verification. The copies from David Miller were an excellent start, but I required documents carrying the undeniable weight of the local government. Wednesday morning, I drove to the Onondaga County Clerk office, located in the heart of downtown Syracuse. I walked through the heavy glass doors and took a numbered ticket from the dispensing machine. The municipal building smelled like industrial floor wax and old, dusty paper. It was a quiet, bureaucratic space, far removed from the high-stakes drama my father was trying to orchestrate. When my number flashed on the digital screen, I approached the counter. An older woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun reviewed my records request form. Her plastic name tag read Helen. She adjusted her reading glasses on the bridge of her nose and typed the parcel identification sequence into her terminal. When the property details populated on her screen, she paused. Her hands stopped moving over the keyboard and she looked up at me. "You are Evelyn Richardson's granddaughter," she said. Her voice carried a warm, nostalgic tone that caught me off guard. I nodded, confirming my identity. Helen smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I processed the original deed transfer when Evelyn first bought that parcel decades ago. She came into this exact office wearing a terrible straw hat, tracking lake sand across the linoleum. She told me she was buying a sanctuary. She said it was the one place where the air felt clean enough to breathe without asking for permission. She loved that dirt fiercely. She always told me she was building a fortress for the next generation." That brief interaction anchored my resolve. The Skaneatelis property was not just a liquid asset waiting to be sold to cover Vanessa's spa debts. It was a generational shield deliberately constructed by a woman who anticipated Thomas's exact brand of greed. Evelyn knew her son would eventually try to consume everything around him. She built a wall he could not climb. I thanked Helen and watched as she applied the raised municipal seal to my printed documents. The heavy metallic clack of the stamp finalizing the certification echoed in the quiet government office. I paid the nominal fee and placed the crisp certified records into my leather portfolio. I now possessed undeniable government-verified proof of ownership. Returning to my apartment, I shifted my focus to the timeline. A successful financial audit relies heavily on proper sequencing. Corporate fraud thrives in the gray areas of overlapping dates and missing context. I intended to eliminate every single shadow in my father's narrative. I opened a new charting program on my dual monitors and built a chronological map of the deception. In the first column, I recorded the exact date my grandmother established the irrevocable trust. In the second column, I logged my 30th birthday, the precise moment the title transferred exclusively into my name, extinguishing any temporary custodial rights. In the third column, I documented the origination date of the commercial loan from Empire State Commercial Bank, cross-referencing the Uniform Commercial Code lien filings I had discovered earlier in the week. The visual representation of the crime was undeniable. The commercial loan was secured years after the property legally bypassed my father's reach. Thomas had walked into a financial institution, presented an obsolete revoked will, and signed a sworn declaration of ownership under penalty of perjury. He committed a federal offense to float a failing wellness venture that sold overpriced face creams. I printed the timeline on premium heavy stock paper. I placed it in a dedicated folder alongside the certified deed and the trust instrument. My case file was bulletproof. It contained zero emotion, zero speculation, and zero room for alternative interpretation. The numbers and dates told a story of premeditated theft. The next phase of my preparation was entirely psychological. I needed to anticipate the atmospheric pressure of the conference room. Thomas would orchestrate the seating arrangement to establish dominance early in the meeting. He would position Julian Sterling as the supreme authority figure, using the lawyer's expensive tailored suit and Manhattan corner office as props to intimidate me. Susan would play the role of the devastated mother deploying strategic tears to trigger my inherent guilt. Vanessa would sit silently, projecting deep fragility, acting as the innocent victim of my supposed selfishness. They expected me to arrive defensive, confused, and overwhelmed by the legal terminology. They anticipated a rapid capitulation. The quitclaim deed would be pushed across the table under the guise of a routine corporate restructuring, and they believed I would sign it just to escape the suffocating tension in the room. To maintain their illusion of control, I made a critical tactical decision. I would not hire my own legal counsel to attend the meeting. Walking into Sterling & Associates accompanied by a litigator would immediately signal that I understood the true nature of the documents. It would prompt Julian Sterling to raise his professional defenses, delay the signing process, and potentially advise Thomas to seek a quiet settlement before the bank fraud could be formally exposed on the record. I did not want a quiet settlement. I wanted Thomas to feel invincible right up until the exact moment the floor collapsed beneath his feet. I wanted him to confess to the collateral pledge out loud in front of a licensed officer of the court before realizing I held the true deed to the property. Showing up alone carrying only a simple leather portfolio was the perfect camouflage. I was weaponizing their own lifelong underestimation of my capabilities. They always saw me as the dependable, boring accountant. I was going to let them keep believing that. Thursday evening arrived, bringing a quiet stillness to my apartment. My overnight bag was packed for the early morning train trip to Manhattan. The portfolio sat by the door containing the certified trust, the municipal deed, and the timeline of the bank fraud. I had reviewed my talking points until they were committed to muscle memory. I knew exactly when to stay silent, when to ask a clarifying question, and when to slide the certified documents across the mahogany table. I poured a glass of sparkling water and stood by the window, watching the Syracuse traffic flow through the twilight. The anxiety that usually accompanied family interactions was entirely absent. I felt nothing but a cold, steady anticipation. I was ready to close this chapter of my life permanently. I was ready to sever the ties using their own legal instruments. At 8:30, my cell phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. The screen illuminated the dim room, casting a pale glow over the granite surface. I walked over and picked up the device. It was a text message from my father. The communication was brief, demanding, and entirely devoid of any parental warmth or greeting. It read, "Friday at 10 a.m. Do not be late and do not make this harder than it has to be." I read the words twice, absorbing the sheer arrogance of his command. He still believed he was the director of this play. He still thought he held the power to dictate my future with a single text message. I locked the screen, placed the phone next to my keys, and turned off the kitchen lights. I did not reply. I would deliver my answer in person. Friday morning brought a cold slate-gray sky over Manhattan. I stepped off the early train at Penn Station and navigated the crowded sidewalks toward the Midtown Financial District. The skyscraper housing Sterling & Associates stood 50 stories tall, a monolith of steel and tinted glass projecting raw corporate authority. I walked through the revolving doors and crossed the expansive marble lobby, my leather portfolio tucked securely under my arm. A silent high-speed elevator carried me to the 50th floor. The reception area smelled of rich leather and fresh lilies. The walls were decorated with large, abstract modern art pieces that seemed specifically chosen to distract clients from the brutal mathematics happening in the back offices. A receptionist wearing a tailored blazer asked for my name, handed me a visitor badge, and guided me down a long, hushed corridor. We passed rows of closed doors where millions of dollars were being quietly divided. We reached a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling transparent walls. The space offered a sweeping, dizzying view of the city skyline. The architecture was deliberately designed to make outsiders feel small, isolated, and inconsequential. I stepped through the heavy oak door. The seating arrangement was already established, confirming every prediction I formulated in my Syracuse apartment. My father Thomas sat at the head of the long mahogany table. He positioned himself with his back to the windows, forcing anyone looking at him to squint against the morning glare. He wore a crisp navy suit and projected an aura of undeniable triumph. Susan sat to his left, her hands folded neatly in her lap, performing the role of the quiet, devoted wife enduring a heavy tragedy. Vanessa occupied the seat to his right. She wore a designer silk blouse projecting wealth, but the facade was cracking under the strain. I observed her hands resting on the polished wood. Vanessa always prided herself on flawless grooming, treating her physical appearance as a primary currency. She spent her commercial loan money on Italian marble waiting rooms and imported aesthetics rather than a sustainable business model. Today, her expensive shellac manicure was chipped and jagged. As I took the lone empty chair at the opposite end of the table, the seat closest to the exit, I watched her thumbnail dig sharply into her index cuticle. She picked at the skin until a tiny bead of dark red blood appeared. The failing wellness spa was suffocating her, and her nervous destruction of her own skin was the physical manifestation of her hidden panic. Julian Sterling sat next to Thomas, organizing a neat stack of legal files. The attorney wore a bespoke charcoal suit with silver cufflinks. He exuded the polished, unbothered confidence of a man who billed thousands of dollars an hour to make rich men richer. He looked up, offered a thin, practiced smile, and introduced himself. He did not ask how my train ride was. He did not offer any welcoming small talk. He treated my presence as a minor administrative hurdle standing between him and his weekend leisure plans. Thomas leaned forward, steepling his fingers. He spoke in a low, benevolent tone, imitating a generous patriarch bestowing a gift upon a wayward child. He thanked me for attending. He delivered a rehearsed monologue about how hard he worked to build the logistics firm, framing it as the beating heart of our surname. He stated that the company was entering an exciting new phase of debt consolidation. He used corporate buzzwords like synergy bridge capital and generational asset protection. He framed the impending paperwork as a mere administrative necessity, a simple formality required to finalize the corporate transition. He looked me directly in the eyes and adopted a tone of deep parental patience. "We are doing this to protect the legacy for everyone, Amanda. We just need to tidy up a few loose ends on the ledger. Family must stand together during these transitions." Julian Sterling took the cue seamlessly. He slid a thick stack of printed pages across the smooth mahogany surface. The packet stopped directly in front of me. The lawyer placed a heavy gold-trimmed fountain pen on top of the title page. He tapped his index finger against the bottom right corner of the document. "I need your signature on page 47, Julian stated. His voice was smooth and profoundly patronizing. He spoke slowly as if explaining geometry to a toddler. "It is a standard release of interest form. The underwriting department requires it to streamline the collateral schedule for the new bridge loan. Collateral is just the security the bank holds. Just sign and date the bottom line, and we will have you out of here in 5 minutes so you can enjoy the city." The room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Thomas watched me with a smug expression, certain that his psychological warfare had succeeded. Susan stared at the floor, refusing to witness the theft. Vanessa stopped picking at her cuticle and held her breath. They expected me to lower my head, pick up the pen, and surrender my inheritance out of sheer intimidation. They believed I was too overwhelmed by the Manhattan skyline, the bespoke suits, and the suffocating family tension to read the fine print. I did not reach for the pen. I slowly pulled the 60-page packet toward the edge of the table. I flipped past the executive summary, past the indemnification clauses, and stopped directly on page 47. The quitclaim deed. I kept my posture relaxed, leaning back slightly in the leather chair. I read the text in silence for 60 seconds. My eyes scanned the clauses designed to strip my ownership rights without offering a single cent of financial compensation. The quiet stretched, becoming thick and uncomfortable. Thomas shifted his weight, his patience fraying at the edges. He cleared his throat loudly. I ignored him. I looked up from the paper and focused my attention entirely on the corporate attorney. I ignored my father. I ignored my sister. I addressed the licensed officer of the court who drafted the legal instrument, Mr. Sterling. I began keeping my vocal tone flat and highly inquisitive, regarding this waiver of exemption. If I execute this quitclaim deed today, how exactly does the bank plan to cure the existing title defect without triggering a retroactive default on the commercial loan originated 3 months ago? I did not stop there. I continued layering the specialized terminology to construct a trap he could not evade. A commercial lender requires a clear, unencumbered chain of title prior to the disbursement of capital under Uniform Commercial Code regulations. Since the collateral schedule lists the Scaniatales parcel, and this deed transfers my sole interest to the corporate entity today, that implies the original financing statement filed 90 days ago was secured by an asset my father did not legally own. Are you advising me to sign an instrument that retroactively cures a fraudulent pledge? The atmosphere in the room shifted so fast, it felt like the climate control system had failed. The smugness vanished from Thomas's face, replaced by a rigid, terrified pallor. Vanessa let out a short, sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth to cover the sound. Julian Sterling reached out to take a sip from his crystal water glass, but his hand stopped halfway to his face. His arm hovered in the air. His eyes narrowed, darting from my calm expression down to the document resting in front of me, and then slowly turning toward his client. The polished, condescending lawyer realized instantly that he was not dealing with a frightened daughter. He was staring at a senior financial auditor who spoke fluent legalese and who had just identified a federal bank fraud hidden deep inside his billable hours. Julian Sterling froze in his chair. His expensive gold fountain pen lay abandoned on the polished wood. For a man who charged premium rates to navigate corporate disasters, being ambushed by a target he assumed was defenseless caused a visible system failure. The attorney looked at my father, expecting Thomas to intervene to shut down the insubordination. But Thomas was speechless, his jaw clamped shut, processing the sudden shift in the room atmospheric pressure. Sterling tried to recover his professional composure. He adjusted his silk tie, cleared his throat, and attempted to deploy a placating, dismissive tone. Ms. Richardson, you are overthinking standard boilerplate language. This is a routine waiver. Commercial lenders often require omnibus title updates during debt consolidation processes. I am not asking about boilerplate language. Mr. Sterling, I said, keeping my gaze locked onto his eyes. I am asking about the specific asset listed on page 47 of your Exhibit B, the Scaniatales parcel. I am asking you to explain on the record what this instrument actually accomplishes. Lawyers live and die by their ethical boundaries, especially when sitting in front of potential witnesses. Julian could not lie to me. If he misrepresented the legal nature of the document, and I signed it based on his false counsel, he would be guilty of malpractice and complicit in fraud. He inhaled a slow, careful breath. The document, Julian began, weighing every syllable like a man walking across thin ice, transfers your ownership interest to Richardson Regional Logistics. It serves to... He hesitated, searching for a sanitized corporate phrase. To cure a title defect, I provided the words for him, my voice echoing slightly off the glass walls. Julian swallowed hard. his Adam's apple bobbing above his crisp collar. Yes. To cure a title defect discovered by Empire State Commercial Bank during their recent audit of the collateral schedule. Thank you, I replied, maintaining a steady conversational volume. So the bank discovered the borrower pledged an asset he did not own, and you drafted this release to retroactively legitimize that unauthorized transaction. Julian did not answer. His silence was the loudest sound in the skyscraper. My father operates on velocity. He bullies his opponents into quick decisions, generating artificial urgency to prevent them from reading the details. He built his trucking empire by cornering logistics managers and forcing them to sign unfavorable contracts before they could consult their own legal teams. My measured, deliberate pacing was destroying his primary weapon. The facade of the benevolent patriarch dissolved into raw frustration. Thomas lifted his left arm and began tapping the crystal face of his heavy gold wristwatch with sharp, frantic strikes. The hard clack of his fingernail against the glass echoed down the long table, acting like a metronome ticking down to an explosion. His posture stiffened, his shoulders rising toward his ears as the illusion of his control evaporated. Enough! Thomas barked, his voice ragged and tearing through the quiet boardroom. We are not conducting a law school seminar, Amanda. We have schedules to keep. The bank needs that paperwork filed by noon. Pick up the pen and sign the damn page. I did not look at the pen. I turned my head slowly, shifting my focus from the corporate attorney to the man who spent my entire childhood treating me like a disposable asset. I have one more question, I said, leaning forward, just a fraction of an inch. No more questions, Thomas snapped, slamming his flat palm against the mahogany surface. The water in Julian crystal glass rippled from the sudden impact. You have played your little game. You proved you know some banking vocabulary. Congratulations. Now do what you were brought here to do. When you originated this $310,000 loan 90 days ago, I continued ignoring his outburst entirely and keeping my vocal pitch perfectly even. Did you represent to the commercial lender that you owned the Skaneatelis property free and clear? Susan whimpered, a soft, pathetic sound escaping her throat. She sat perfectly still, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. She understood exactly what I was asking. She knew the mechanics of the crime because she likely sat next to him when he submitted the false paperwork. Vanessa stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. She stopped picking at her bloody cuticle. The reality of the situation finally pierced her entitlement. She realized the conversation had steered far away from saving her boutique and was heading toward a catastrophic cliff. Thomas leaned over the table, his face flushed dark red with unbridled arrogance. He was so accustomed to total obedience that he could not recognize a trap even when his foot was resting directly on the trigger plate. He viewed my highly specific question as a childish challenge to his authority, and Thomas Richardson never backs down from a challenge. He operates under the delusion that his status exempts him from consequences. Yes, of course I did, he spat, his voice filled with venom and righteous indignation. It is family property. Now sign it. I let his words hang in the air. The confession was pristine. It was unambiguous. He had just admitted to fraudulent misrepresentation on the record in front of a licensed officer of the court. Julian Sterling closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second. The attorney pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling a long, defeated breath. The high-priced litigator knew the legal implications of that sentence. His client had just confessed to a federal felony in the middle of a corporate meeting. By admitting he pledged an asset he knew belonged to the family rather than his own corporate entity, Thomas verified the intent to deceive the financial institution. A genuine, relaxed smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled since arriving at my parents' house the previous Friday. The expression unnerved Thomas more than any argument could. He expected defiance. He expected tears. He expected me to crumble under the weight of his anger. He did not expect serene, triumphant satisfaction. Thank you, Dad, I said quietly. I reached down to the floor beside my chair. I picked up my black leather portfolio and placed it onto the center of the table. The zipper made a loud, rasping noise in the quiet room as I pulled it open. I reached inside and withdrew the thick stack of premium heavy stock paper I had organized in my Syracuse apartment. I did not rush. I peeled the top document from the stack and slid it across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of Julian Sterling. It was the certified copy of Evelyn Richardson Irrevocable Trust. The heavy raised seal of the Onondaga County clerk shimmered under the recessed boardroom lighting, catching the morning sun reflecting off the neighboring skyscrapers. Next, I slid the official property deed displaying the unbroken chain of title transferring exclusive ownership to me upon my 30th birthday. The municipal stamps on the bottom corner verified its authenticity. Finally, I placed my chronological timeline on top, detailing the dates of the trust transfer versus the origination date of the commercial loan. The chart was simple, color-coded, and devastating. I laid the evidence face up, exposing the anatomy of a crime. The room descended into a suffocating quiet. I watched Julian Sterling lean forward to read the certified government documents. His eyes scanned the precise legal language my grandmother, estate attorney, had drafted 12 years prior. He read the irrevocable transfer clauses. He noted the execution dates. He saw the municipal verification stamps that proved the paper was not a draft, but the final recorded law of the county. Julian then looked at the timeline I had constructed. It laid out the sequence of events with surgical precision, showing that the commercial lien from Empire State Commercial Bank was executed long after Thomas had been stripped of any custodial rights. The lawyer traced the dates with his index finger, verifying the mathematical impossibility of his client's sworn collateral schedule. Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing as he watched his expensive attorney examine the papers. He tried to read the text upside down from his seat, but the dense paragraphs offered him no comfort. "What is that?" Thomas demanded, pointing a trembling finger at the stack. "What did you bring into this room?" Susan covered her mouth with both hands, shrinking into her expensive chair as if trying to disappear into the upholstery. Vanessa looked between me and the lawyer, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I kept my hands resting gently on my lap, holding my father's gaze. "I brought the truth." I answered, my voice steady and unwavering. "I brought the proof that you attempted to steal my inheritance to cover your own financial incompetence." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. The corporate attorney stopped reading, slowly placed his hands flat on the table, and realized he was sitting in the blast radius of a detonating bomb. Julian Sterling traced the raised emblem of the Onondaga County clerk with his manicured index finger. The tactile reality of the municipal seal grounded the terrifying truth sitting on his mahogany conference table. He was a senior partner at a prestigious Manhattan law firm. He billed thousands of dollars an hour to construct legal shields for wealthy corporate clients. He did not draft instruments to conceal active federal crimes. Yet as his eyes moved from the certified irrevocable trust instrument to the official property deed, the color slowly drained from his cheeks. His usually healthy complexion turned a pale, sickly shade of gray. A corporate lawyer faces no greater professional nightmare than discovering he has been weaponized by his own client. Julian recognized the dates. He compared the timeline I had constructed against the date of the quitclaim deed he had drafted just 48 hours prior. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The 60-page restructuring packet he had proudly presented minutes ago was not a routine consolidation strategy. It was a toxic liability. He realized the waiver of exemption he pushed across the table was an instrument of fraud designed to retroactively cover up a felony. If I had signed that paper under his counsel, he would be facing disbarment, malpractice, and potential indictment as a co-conspirator. I maintained my silence, allowing the attorney to process the full scope of his client deception. I wanted the silence to stretch. I wanted the atmospheric pressure in the room to build until the narrative my father constructed shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. I turned my attention to the head of the table. Thomas watched his lawyer with growing unease. He did not understand the legal gravity of the certified government documents resting in front of Julian. My father only understood leverage, and he could feel his grip slipping away. I decided to educate him. I spoke directly to the room, keeping my vocal delivery steady, unhurried, and echoing off the transparent glass walls. 12 years ago, I began. Evelyn Richardson walked into a municipal building in Syracuse and protected her sanctuary. She knew you viewed every asset as a poker chip, Thomas. She established this irrevocable trust to ensure you could never touch the Scaniatalis parcel. She structured the instrument so that upon my 30th birthday, the title bypassed your reach entirely and vested exclusively in my name. I am the sole legal owner of that dirt, the structure, and the equity. Across the table, Susan let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Her right hand flew to her mouth, covering her trembling lips. The sound was pathetic, the noise of a silent enabler, realizing the paper trail was not buried in an old filing cabinet. She recognized the gravity of the documents. She knew about the revoked will. She likely sat in the passenger seat of the car when Thomas drove to the commercial lender to submit the false paperwork. Now the undeniable evidence of their shared lie was resting face up under the bright fluorescent boardroom lights, exposed to a licensed officer of the court. 90 days ago, I continued holding my father trapped in my gaze. You approached Empire State Commercial Bank. You needed an emergency capital injection to keep Vanessa Wellness Spa from defaulting. The commercial underwriters demanded hard collateral. Since your logistics fleet was already leveraged to its breaking point, you presented an obsolete revoked draft of grandmother estate plan. You signed a sworn affidavit claiming you owned the lake house free and clear. Thomas gripped the thick edges of the mahogany table. His knuckles turned stark white against the dark wood. The smug, benevolent patriarch routine evaporated. That specific action I stated, delivering the final audit finding, constitutes textbook bank fraud. You pledged an asset you possess zero legal rights to encumber. You lied to a financial institution to secure $310,000. When the bank recently audited the collateral schedule and discovered the true county deed, they cornered you. They threatened to call the loan. This meeting is not a corporate restructuring to save 50 employees. This is an extortion attempt. You demanded my presence here because you need me to sign that quitclaim deed to retroactively validate your fraudulent pledge. You thought you could trick me into surrendering my inheritance to keep you out of a federal courtroom. The truth stripped away the polished veneer of the Manhattan skyscraper. It exposed the raw, desperate theft hiding underneath the expensive suits. Thomas erupted. His narcissistic pride could not accept defeat, especially at the hands of the daughter he had always treated as a secondary citizen. He pushed his heavy leather chair back so hard it crashed into the glass wall behind him. He stood up, looming over the table, his face flushed a dangerous, unpredictable shade of crimson. "You ungrateful wretch!" Thomas yelled, his voice cracking with unbridled rage. "I put a roof over your head for 18 years. I paid for your existence. That property belongs to the Richardson family name, and I built this family. You owe us this security." He pointed a shaking finger at the quitclaim deed resting near my portfolio. He abandoned all logic and resorted to the only tactic he had left: pure aggressive intimidation. "You are going to pick up that pen and sign the paper right now," he demanded, spit flying from his lips. "You are going to save your sister. If her spa goes under, she loses everything. She loses her apartment. She faces total bankruptcy. The bank will seize my trucks. You have the power to fix this entire situation, and you are sitting there quoting legal definitions like a cold, heartless machine. Sign the document." Vanessa shrank down into her chair, attempting to make herself as small as possible. Her expensive designer silk blouse suddenly looked like a cheap Halloween costume. She stared at the polished wood, unable to meet my eyes, finally understanding the true cost of her vanity project. She was the catalyst for the destruction of the family empire. She was the reason her father was facing a federal criminal record. The delusional entitlement that fueled her text message a month ago was replaced by suffocating terror. I did not flinch at his yelling. I did not raise my voice to match his volume. I looked at the man who spent 3 decades treating my life as a disposable asset, and I delivered my final verdict. "I will not commit a federal felony to subsidize Vanessa business failures," I said, my tone carrying the chill of a Syracuse winter. I will not adopt your fraudulent pledge. I will not surrender my inheritance to cure your title defect. You made a false declaration to a commercial lender. You can face the consequences of your own arrogance. The finality of my words hung heavy in the air. There was no room for negotiation. There was no compromise to be found. Julian Sterling snapped into survival mode. The ethical obligations of his legal license and the threat of severe penal consequences overrode his lucrative retainer fee. He could not allow his firm to participate in a criminal cover-up for another second. He reached across the table and swiftly gathered the quitclaim deed, pulling the toxic document away from my side of the table. The attorney stood up abruptly. He did not look at Thomas. He did not offer Susan or Vanessa a parting glance. He gathered his case files, stuffed them into his leather briefcase, and snapped the brass locks shut. The sharp metallic click cut right through my father, heavy breathing. "This meeting is suspended," Julian announced, his voice tight, rigid, and entirely devoid of the patronizing warmth he had displayed 20 minutes earlier. "We are done here." Julian Sterling did not just stand up from the mahogany table. He executed a tactical, highly calculated retreat. A partner at a premier Manhattan law firm survives by avoiding toxic liability, and my father had just transformed himself into a radioactive asset. Julian grabbed the fraudulent quitclaim deed, shoved it into his leather briefcase, and snapped the brass latches shut. The sharp metallic sound cut through the heavy, suffocating silence of the 50th floor conference room. Thomas stared at his attorney, his face a mask of bewildered outrage. He could not comprehend someone defying his payroll. "Sit back down," Julian Thomas ordered. His voice held the harsh, grating tone of a dictator accustomed to blind obedience. "We are paying your firm a premium retainer to handle this transition. You work for me. Fix this." Julian paused halfway to the exit. He did not turn around to face his client. He spoke to the glass wall in front of him, prioritizing his professional survival over any polite farewell. "Effective immediately, Sterling and Associates withdraws as your legal counsel," Julian stated. His voice was clipped rigid and stripped of all previous warmth. The New York rules of professional conduct strictly prohibit an attorney from representing a client engaged in fraudulent misrepresentation. You pledged a high-value asset to a commercial financial institution, knowing you did not hold the legal title. You then attempted to use my firm to draft an instrument to conceal that deception. We are severing this relationship. My office will forward your remaining retainer balance minus our billed hours by the end of the business day. Do not contact me again. Julian reached the heavy oak and glass door. He pulled the polished steel handle, stepped into the hushed corridor, and let the door swing shut behind him. The brass latch engaged with a sharp final click. That single sound echoed through the room. It was the sound of my father losing his ultimate shield. Without Julian Sterling, Thomas was no longer a powerful regional executive navigating a complex corporate restructuring. He was just a desperate man sitting in a borrowed room, waiting for a bank to discover his felony. The reality of the situation crashed into the remaining occupants of the room. Vanessa shattered first. My sister had spent her entire adult life insulated from consequences. She funded her luxury apartment and her high-end wellness spa, using the capital our father extracted from his logistics company. She never worried about payroll vendors or lease agreements because Thomas always functioned as her personal safety net. Now, the net was gone. The commercial lender was going to seize the spa, and there was no lawyer left to stall the execution. Vanessa gripped the edges of her hair, pulling the expensive blonde extensions tight against her scalp. She let out a guttural, high-pitched sob that bordered on a scream. "I'm going to lose everything," she shrieked, her voice echoing against the transparent walls. "The vendors are going to lock the doors on Monday. The landlord is going to evict me." "You promised me this was handled, Dad. You told me the lawyer was going to fix the loan." She turned her panic toward Thomas, abandoning her role as the quiet, fragile victim. Her tears were no longer a strategic performance designed to make me feel guilty. They were tears of genuine, unfiltered ruin. She was watching her vanity project evaporate in real time. "What am I supposed to do?" she wailed, smearing her expensive mascara across her cheeks. "The bank is going to take my inventory. They are going to take my car. I have nothing else." Thomas ignored her crying. He was too consumed by his own impending destruction to offer her any comfort. He turned his attention back to me. His chest heaved. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He realized I held the keys to his survival, and since intimidation had failed, he resorted to unhinged threats. He leaned across the mahogany table, pointing a thick, shaking finger at my face. "You think you won?" Thomas snarled. His words dripped with pure malice. "You think you can walk in here with a few county stamps and destroy my life? I built that logistics company with my bare hands. I will not let a spiteful, ungrateful accountant tear it down. I will ruin you, Amanda. I will call the managing partner of your firm every single day. I will drag you into civil court and bury you in so much litigation you will never be able to afford your own rent. I will make sure everyone in our family knows you abandoned your sister to the wolves." I watched his face contort with rage. As a financial analyst, I evaluate risk for a living. I assess threats based on the leverage the opposing party holds. Thomas held zero leverage. His threats were empty. He was promising to fund a civil lawsuit against me while standing on the edge of a total asset freeze. The commercial bank was about to lock his accounts, seize his trucking fleet, and report him for federal bank fraud. He would not have enough liquid capital to hire a defense attorney, let alone fund a frivolous civil suit against his own daughter. I did not argue with him. I did not engage with his screaming. I simply reached across the table and began gathering my documents. I picked up the certified property deed, the irrevocable trust instrument, and the chronological timeline of his crime. I tapped the heavy stock paper against the table to align the edges, opened my black leather portfolio, and placed the files inside. I pulled the metal zipper closed. I stood up from my chair and pushed it back under the table. I looked down at my mother. Susan had not spoken a single word since I produced the certified trust. She sat frozen in her expensive chair, silent tears streaming down her face. She was the great enabler of the Richardson family. She watched Thomas favor Vanessa for decades. She watched Thomas steal my inheritance. She likely knew about the fake will and the fraudulent commercial loan, but she chose to remain quiet to preserve her comfortable lifestyle. She traded my future for her own security. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading for a mercy she did not deserve. I slung my portfolio over my shoulder and looked directly into her weeping eyes. "Last Friday you sat at your dining room table and watched this man demand $310,000 from me," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "You told me I had 7 days to liquidate my savings or I was no longer part of this family." Susan squeezed her eyes shut, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her eyelashes. She shook her head slightly, unable to defend her own silence. "I want to thank you for that ultimatum." I continued my words, cutting through Vanessa, hysterical sobbing, and Thomas, heavy breathing. "That 7-day deadline was the greatest gift you ever provided. It gave me the exact amount of time I needed to audit your lies, locate my grandmother trust, and secure my own future." I turned my back on them. I did not wait for a response. I walked toward the heavy oak door, pushed the polished steel handle, and stepped out into the hushed corridor. The sound of Vanessa screaming my father's name faded as the heavy door sealed shut behind me. I walked down the long hallway past the abstract modern art and handed my visitor badge to the receptionist. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the car descended 50 floors in silence, I felt a physical shift in my body. My shoulders, which had carried the crushing weight of their expectations and demands for 32 years, finally relaxed. I walked out of the skyscraper and stepped onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk. The crisp New York air hit my face, the noise of the city wrapped around me. Sirens blared in the distance, taxi tires hissed against the pavement, pedestrians rushed past me clutching briefcases and coffee cups. It was a chaotic, beautiful symphony of independence. For the first time in my life, I was not anticipating the next crisis my father would orchestrate. I was not bracing for the next demand. I was entirely untethered. I hailed a taxi to take me back to Penn Station. As the yellow car merged into the heavy midtown traffic, I looked out the window at the towering skyline. My part of the war was over. I had protected my assets and established an impenetrable boundary. But the dominoes I tipped over in that conference room were just beginning to fall, and the commercial bank was about to collect its due. I returned to Syracuse and spent the weekend catching up on sleep. While my apartment remained peaceful, a financial hurricane was forming downstate. Julian Sterling did not waste a single minute protecting his firm. When a corporate attorney discovers a client has used their services to mask a federal crime, the ethical guidelines are explicit. The lawyer must withdraw representation immediately, but they are also compelled to notify the affected financial institutions to prevent further damages. By Monday morning, Julian filed a formal notice with Empire State Commercial Bank disclaiming the obsolete estate affidavit Thomas had submitted. The high-priced litigator handed the commercial underwriters the exact truth I had laid on the mahogany conference table. Monday afternoon, I was sitting at my desk at the accounting firm reviewing a quarterly tax projection for a corporate client. My dual monitors displayed rows of stable, predictable data. A small notification pinged in the corner of my screen. It was an automated message from the Internal Revenue Service and my personal certified public accountant. The email confirmed that my final change of address request was processed successfully. Every tax document, every financial statement, and every trace of my economic existence was officially untethered from my parents' residential mailing code. It was a simple administrative confirmation, just a few lines of plain text, but it carried immense weight. It was a quiet symbol of my total separation. I closed the tab, smiled at the glowing monitor, and went back to work. While I was archiving emails, the commercial lenders were executing a swift and brutal retaliation against my father. Banks do not operate on emotion, they operate on risk mitigation. The moment the underwriting department received Julian notification regarding the fraudulent collateral the automated safeguards triggered, Empire State Commercial Bank instantly froze every credit line associated with Richardson Regional Logistics. The operational shutdown was instantaneous. The operating accounts, the payroll reserves, and the emergency capital funds were locked behind administrative walls. Out on the interstate highways, long-haul truck drivers working for my father pulled into way stations and truck stops only to find their corporate fuel cards declining at the pump. The logistics empire stalled in a single afternoon. The financial freeze extended directly to Vanessa Luxury Spa. By Tuesday morning, her business debit cards bounced at the local supplier. Her premium vendors received insufficient fund notifications. The commercial leaseholder already owed months of back rent filed an immediate eviction notice. Creditors arrived at her Manhattan storefront before the lunch hour. They carried heavy steel padlocks and official court orders. Vanessa watched from the sidewalk as indifferent men chained the glass doors shut, trapping her imported marble fixtures, expensive aesthetic machinery, and wilting eucalyptus displays inside. Her vanity project was dead suffocated by the exact same bank she thought would save her. Thomas fared much worse. The bank formally called in the $310,000 bridge loan. Because the primary security, my lake house, was invalid, the lender activated the cross-default clauses buried deep within my father's original corporate filings. They bypassed the stranded logistics equipment and went straight for his personal assets. On Wednesday, a county sheriff walked up the manicured driveway of my parents' sprawling 5-bedroom suburban home. The officer nailed a legal notice to the front door, right above Susan Decorative's seasonal wreath. The bank placed a heavy commercial lien against their primary residence. Thomas and Susan were effectively trapped. They could not sell the house, they could not refinance the mortgage, and they faced imminent foreclosure if the balance remained unpaid. The business empire my father built to command respect from his peers was now the anchor dragging him to the bottom. My father had spent his entire adult life dictating terms. He controlled his employees with an iron fist, manipulated his wife into silence, and weaponized his checkbook to keep Vanessa dependent. Now the banking institution had stripped him of every tool in his arsenal. He could not yell at an automated account freeze. He could not intimidate a court-appointed creditor. He was powerless against the institutional machinery. When a narcissist loses control of their environment, they often retreat into a fabricated reality where they still possess ultimate authority. Thomas could not accept that a daughter he viewed as a mere ledger entry had outmaneuvered his corporate strategy. He convinced himself that the paperwork did not matter. He believed that his bloodline superseded municipal deeds and irrevocable trusts. In his deteriorating state of mind, the Scaniatales property was still his birthright. It was the physical manifestation of the Richardson legacy, and since the bank was taking his suburban home, he decided to claim the lake house by force. Thursday evening brought a fierce, unseasonable rainstorm to upstate New York. I was standing in my kitchen preparing a simple dinner, listening to the heavy drops batter my windows. My phone buzzed on the granite island. The caller ID displayed the name Martin, a retired structural engineer who lived in the cabin directly adjacent to my lake house. Martin was a quiet, observant man who kept a watchful eye on the property during the off-season. I answered the call expecting a routine update about a fallen tree branch or a loose dock plank. Amanda Martin said, his voice laced with concern, masking the sound of the driving rain in the background. "I thought you were staying in the city this week." "I am in Syracuse, Martin," I replied, lowering the heat on the stove. "Is everything all right out there on the water?" "There is a vehicle parked in your driveway," he explained. "It pulled in about 20 minutes ago. A dark blue sedan." The driver bypassed the front security gate, walked up onto the wraparound deck, and tried to force the front door open. When the deadbolt held, he walked around to the back patio and shattered the sliding glass window. He is inside the house right now. The house, right? I felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. My analytical mind began processing the variables. "Did you get a look at the man?" I asked. Martin paused, taking a breath before delivering the confirmation. The exterior floodlights caught his face before he broke the glass. "It is your father, Amanda." The entitlement was staggering. Thomas, facing total financial ruin and a federal bank fraud investigation, decided to physically occupy a house he did not own. He shattered a window to trespass on the very property he had just tried to steal on paper. He was staking a physical claim, daring me to remove him. He wanted to force a messy, emotional confrontation on familiar ground, hoping he could still bully me into submission without the presence of high-priced lawyers. I thanked Martin for his vigilance. I instructed him to stay inside his cabin, lock his doors, and wait for my next call. I ended the connection and turned off the stove. The calm, detached strategy of the Manhattan boardroom was over. The conflict had just moved from the sterile environment of corporate law to the muddy, rain-soaked reality of my own front porch. My father wanted a confrontation on his terms. He was about to learn that I understood the laws of property rights just as well as I understood the rules of commercial finance. I reached for my car keys, dialed the local county dispatcher, and prepared to deliver his final eviction notice. The rain pounded against my windshield as I navigated the winding rural roads toward the eastern shore of Scaniatales Lake. The severe storm reflected the turbulence my father brought into every environment he touched. I drove with methodical precision. I did not rush. The panic belonged to him now. I arrived at the county sheriff's substation, situated 3 miles from the waterfront. The brick building stood as a beacon of bureaucratic order amidst the relentless downpour. I walked through the glass double doors, holding my black leather portfolio. The duty officer at the front desk was a veteran deputy named Miller. His uniform was crisp, his demeanor evaluating and calm. I placed the certified property deed, the irrevocable trust instrument, and the text message from my neighbor on the counter. I explained that an unauthorized individual had shattered a glass pane to occupy my residence. Deputy Miller inspected the raised municipal seals. He understood the legal weight of the documents. He instructed me to follow his patrol cruiser. We were going to serve a formal eviction mandate. The flashing red and blue lights of the cruiser sliced through the dark torrential rain as we pulled into the gravel driveway of the lake house. 2 vehicles sat parked near the front steps. One was the dark blue sedan belonging to my father. The other was a luxury sport utility vehicle registered to Vanessa. The presence of both cars painted a pathetic picture. They were not just staging a temporary protest, they were attempting to squat. The commercial bank had frozen their operational capital and placed a lien on their suburban mansion. Vanessa Wellness Spa was padlocked. They fled the collapsing wreckage of their financial empire and sought refuge in the only fortress left standing. The supreme irony was impossible to ignore. The sanctuary my grandmother built specifically to keep Thomas away was the exact location he ran toward when his world burned. I stepped out of my car, pulling my waterproof jacket tight against the freezing wind. Deputy Miller walked beside me, the beam of his heavy flashlight sweeping across the property. We ascended the wooden steps of the wraparound deck. The exterior floodlights illuminated a pile of matching expensive leather luggage resting carelessly on the planks. I paused at the top of the stairs. The bags were stacked directly on top of an antique cedar porch swing. Evelyn spent an entire summer sanding and staining that swing by hand. She taught me how to measure the joints, how to appreciate the grain of the wood, and how to build something that could weather any storm. Seeing Vanessa imported designer suitcases crushing that handcrafted heirloom perfectly summarized their collective existence. They consumed the hard work of others without ever understanding the value of the foundation. Before I could knock, the heavy oak front door swung open. Thomas stood in the threshold. Susan and Vanessa hovered anxiously in the shadows behind his shoulders. My father wore a rumpled gray sweater. His posture was defensive, yet he tried to project his usual boardroom authority. He looked past me, fixing his gaze directly on the uniformed officer. He attempted to command the situation, puffing out his chest and using his deep, authoritative vocal register. "Officer, there is a misunderstanding here," Thomas declared, projecting his voice over the sound of the thunder. "This is a private family dispute. My daughter is throwing a tantrum. This is my childhood home, and we are handling this internal matter ourselves. You can return to your patrol route." He tried to dismiss a sworn officer of the law with the same casual arrogance he used to dismiss his warehouse employees. Deputy Miller did not flinch. The officer turned his head slowly, looking at me for confirmation, and then directed his attention back to the man standing in the doorway. "Sir," the deputy said, his tone flat and unyielding, "the paperwork I reviewed at the station tells a very different story. You do not hold the title to this estate. You shattered a glass sliding door to gain entry tonight. That action classifies you as a trespasser." Thomas flushed a deep, mottled red. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. "She is my flesh and blood," he shouted, attempting to shame me into submission. "You are bringing law enforcement to your own parents. After everything we provided for your upbringing, you are going to throw us out into a storm. We are family." I stood on the wet wooden planks and met his furious glare. "Family does not commit federal bank fraud," I replied, my voice steady and piercing through the howling wind. "Family does not forge corporate documents. You broke a window because you are out of options. The bank seized your logistics fleet, and they placed a commercial lien on your primary residence. You came here to hide from your own consequences." I opened my portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper. It was a formal 72-hour notice to vacate, drafted and notarized earlier that afternoon in Syracuse. I handed the document to Deputy Miller. The officer stepped forward and pressed the paper directly against Thomas' chest, forcing my father to take hold of it. "You have exactly 72 hours to remove all your personal belongings from this parcel," the deputy instructed, his words carrying the full weight of the judicial system. "However, since you forced entry into the structure tonight, you are not spending the evening inside. You will gather whatever items you need for the night, and you will vacate the premises immediately. If I find you on this land tomorrow, without the owner granting express permission, you will leave in the back of my cruiser." The stark reality of the situation finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his pride. Thomas looked at the legal notice in his hand. He looked at the flashing police lights reflecting off the wet gravel driveway. He possessed no corporate lawyers to hide behind, no financial leverage to exploit, and no audience willing to believe his fabricated narrative. He was thoroughly powerless. His shoulders slumped, the arrogant posture collapsing into genuine hollow defeat. He turned around and walked back into the house without saying another word. Susan followed him, keeping her eyes glued to the hardwood floorboards. Vanessa walked out onto the porch, grabbed her heavy designer luggage off the antique swing, and dragged the bags through the mud toward her vehicle. She ruined her expensive leather shoes in the deep puddles, but she did not utter a single complaint. She finally understood that complaining required an audience that cared. I stood on the deck next to the officer and watched them pack their vehicles in humiliated silence. The cold rain soaked their clothes, but they moved with a frantic, desperate energy. The 72-hour clock printed on that legal notice acted as a perfect poetic mirror to the 7-day ultimatum they issued to me at their dining room table. They demanded my financial surrender within a week. I demanded their physical departure in 3 days. The dark blue sedan and the luxury sport utility vehicle started their engines. The headlights swept across the wet pine trees as they reversed out of the gravel driveway, driving away into the stormy night. They were homeless, disgraced, and facing an impending federal investigation. My property was secure. As I walked inside to inspect the shattered glass on the back patio, I knew the institutional fallout was still gathering momentum. Thomas owed the commercial lender hundreds of thousands of dollars, and corporate banks never stop hunting until the ledger is balanced. The true financial collapse of the Richardson empire was imminent. The morning after the eviction, I swept up the shattered glass from the patio floor and taped a thick plastic sheet over the broken window frame. It was a temporary fix for a temporary intrusion. The true repair of my life was happening miles away in downtown courtrooms and bank offices. Over the next month, the institutional machinery crushed Thomas Richardson. Empire State Commercial Bank did not merely call in the loan. They petitioned the New York State Supreme Court to appoint an independent receiver for Richardson Regional Logistics. A receiver is a court-mandated official who strips the owners of all operational control. One Tuesday morning, a team of forensic accountants and security personnel walked into my father's warehouse facility. They demanded his keys, locked him out of his own executive suite, and began liquidating his physical assets to satisfy the commercial debt. The long-haul trucks were parked, cleaned, and sold at commercial auction. The warehouse was emptied. His legacy, built over 30 years, evaporated in less than 30 days. Vanessa faced her own brutal reckoning. Without the logistics company to siphon funds from her vanity project bled out, she filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Chapter 7 is not a reorganization plan. It is a total liquidation. A federal bankruptcy trustee seized her remaining corporate assets. They auctioned off the imported marble reception desks, the aesthetic machinery, and the premium spa inventory. The court also targeted her personal property to satisfy the unrelenting vendor claims. The luxury sport utility vehicle she drove to the lake house was repossessed. The expensive designer luggage she stacked on my grandmother's antique swing was likely sold to cover pennies on the dollar. She moved into a cramped, shared apartment in a distant borough, stripped of the unearned wealth that once defined her entire personality. My father faced a much darker horizon. The fraudulent quitclaim deed and the obsolete estate affidavit he submitted to the commercial lender did not just violate a civil contract. They triggered a federal inquiry. Agents from the White-Collar Crime Division initiated a formal investigation into his loan origination documents. Subpoenas were issued. His remaining bank records were seized. While an indictment takes time to weave its way through the justice system, the looming threat of a federal bank fraud trial hung over his head like a sharpened pendulum. He and Susan were forced to vacate their suburban mansion, retreating to a small rental unit on the outskirts of the county, living in perpetual dread of a knock on the door from federal marshals. As the legal filings multiplied, the public narrative shifted irrevocably. The smear campaign Thomas had meticulously orchestrated against me disintegrated. You cannot convince a community that your daughter is suffering a psychiatric breakdown when your own corporate bankruptcy notices are printed in the local business journals. The truth emerged in undeniable stark black and white ink. Aunt Carol called me on a brisk Tuesday afternoon. The anxiety that saturated her previous phone call was gone, replaced by a heavy, profound contrition. She spoke slowly, navigating the awkwardness of a delayed realization. "Amanda," she said, her tone carrying the weight of sincere regret. "I am so sorry. We all saw the filings in the registry. Uncle David talked to a contact at the commercial bank. The entire family knows what Thomas tried to do. We know he lied about your mental health to cover his own theft." I sat at my kitchen island, looking out over the quiet Syracuse skyline. I did not feel a rush of vindication. I did not experience a triumphant thrill. I listened to Carol recount how the extended relatives were currently distancing themselves from my parents, treating them like toxic pariahs. "Thank you for telling me, Carol," I replied. My voice remained steady. "I appreciate your apology." I ended the call and set the device down. There was no joy in watching the people who raised me plummet into disgrace. Instead, I experienced a complex, layered grief. I mourned the illusion of the family I always wished I possessed. I grieved for the supportive father and the protective mother that existed only in television shows and childhood fantasies. Simultaneously, a wave of profound relief washed over me. I was finally free of the family I actually had. The transactional love, the constant manipulation, the exhausting demands, they were all permanently severed. The emotional ledger was balanced. The next morning at the accounting firm, I logged into the Human Resources digital portal. I navigated to my personal employee profile and clicked on the Emergency Contact tab. For a decade, the names Thomas and Susan Richardson occupied those fields. They were the individuals the company would notify if I experienced a medical crisis. It was a lingering administrative thread tying my survival to their oversight. I highlighted their names. I pressed the delete key. The text vanished, leaving 2 empty white boxes. I typed in the name and cellular number of my closest friend and trusted colleague. I clicked save. The system processed the update, securing the final boundary. My parents were officially erased from my corporate existence. They held no legal, financial, or administrative tether to my life. With the past properly archived, I turned my attention toward the future. The weekend arrived, bringing crisp, clear autumn air to the Finger Lakes region. I drove back down the rural highway toward the Skaneateles property. I did not bring law enforcement this time. I brought a clipboard, a tape measure, and a vision for restoration. I met a local general contractor named Elias on the wraparound wooden deck. Elias was a seasoned craftsman who specialized in preserving historic waterfront properties. We walked the perimeter of the estate. He inspected the shattered sliding glass door on the back patio, taking precise measurements for a reinforced double-paned replacement. We moved to the front of the house, standing near the antique cedar porch swing. I pointed out the weathered floorboards, the faded exterior trim, and the damaged roof shingles. I did not want to sell the house. I did not want to modernize it into a sterile, contemporary mansion. I wanted to restore the sanctuary to the exact condition my grandmother intended. Elias took diligent notes, running his calloused hand along the grain of the wooden railings. He estimated the timeline and the material costs required to bring the structure back to its former glory. He promised to send a detailed contract by Monday morning. I shook his hand, locking in the agreement. After the contractor drove away, I remained on the property. I walked down the gentle slope of the lawn, stopping at the edge of the wooden dock. The dark blue water of the lake rippled gently under the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of pine needles and clean, fresh water. The storm had passed. The trespassers were gone. I stood on the sturdy wooden planks, breathing in the quiet peace of ownership, ready to rebuild the foundation my grandmother left behind. 7 months have passed since the night the county sheriff escorted my parents off the gravel driveway. Spring has finally arrived in upstate New York, melting the winter frost and turning the dense forests around Skaneateles Lake a vibrant, thriving green. The restoration of the property is officially complete. Elias and his crew spent the entire season meticulously repairing the damage time and neglect had inflicted on the structure. They replaced the shattered sliding glass door on the back patio with reinforced double-paned security glass. They sanded down the weathered cedar planks of the wraparound deck, applying a rich weather-resistant sealant that highlights the natural grain of the wood. The roof boasts brand-new architectural shingles, and the antique porch swing sits securely on reinforced steel chains. The physical structure mirrors my own psychological state. It is fortified, clean, and entirely secure. I walked out onto the wooden dock this morning, just as the sun crested over the eastern tree line. The air carried the crisp, clean scent of fresh pine and cold, fresh water. I stood at the edge of the water, holding a heavy ceramic mug filled with dark roast coffee. It is not a cheap novelty gift with a painted slogan. It is a thick, glazed pottery mug that belonged to my grandmother. I remember Evelyn drinking her morning tea from this exact cup 30 years ago while she watched the boats drift across the horizon. Holding it now feels like holding a piece of her enduring wisdom. She built a foundation meant to survive the greed of her own son, and because I refuse to surrender it, her legacy remains intact. My life in Syracuse has stabilized into a rhythm of profound, uninterrupted peace. I achieve a level of financial independence that most people only read about in wealth management seminars. I pulled my personal credit report last week out of sheer professional habit. The score sits at an untouchable 820. There are no mysterious commercial inquiries, no hidden corporate liens, and no outstanding debts. I own the lake house free and clear, without a single mortgage or encumbrance attached to the deed. The emergency fund my father tried to extort is fully replenished and growing steadily in a high-yield municipal bond portfolio. My career trajectory accelerated in the wake of the crisis. When the managing partner of my accounting firm, Gregory, witnessed how clinically I dismantled my father-coordinated smear campaign, he realized I possessed an exceptional capacity for risk management. He recognized that an analyst who can navigate a hostile extortion attempt without losing her composure is an asset during high-stakes corporate audits. 2 months ago, he promoted me to a principal director role. I now oversee the compliance department, ensuring our corporate clients never fall victim to the exact type of fraudulent ledger manipulation my father attempted to execute. The contrast between my current reality and the wreckage of the Richardson family empire is stark. The institutional consequences for Thomas did not end with a simple commercial bankruptcy. The unexpected payoff to his decades of arrogance arrived in the form of a federal indictment. When Empire State Commercial Bank officially registered their losses, the mandatory compliance reports triggered a Department of Justice review. Federal prosecutors do not care about family dynamics or local social status. They only care about paper trails. 3 weeks ago, a federal grand jury convened in Manhattan. They reviewed the obsolete estate affidavit my father submitted, the sworn declaration of ownership he signed, and the undeniable timeline of the irrevocable trust. The grand jury handed down a formal indictment charging Thomas with 2 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of commercial bank fraud. He surrendered his passport, posted a severely depleted bail, and is currently awaiting trial while confined to a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment on the outskirts of the county. He faces a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Vanessa was forced to enter the actual workforce. Stripped of her luxury vehicles and her subsidized Manhattan apartment, she secured a minimum-wage retail job selling the exact type of overpriced face creams she used to stock in her failed spa. She punches a time clock, answers to a shift manager, and commutes on public transportation. Susan remains paralyzed by the reality of her choices, sitting in a small rental unit, watching her husband prepare for a criminal trial that will likely end with his incarceration. They built a kingdom on a foundation of unearned entitlement and stolen equity, and they are currently buried under the rubble. I sit on the dock taking a slow sip of hot coffee and reflect on the journey that brought me to this quiet morning. Society often conditions us to view setting a boundary as an act of hostility. People are taught that walking away from blood relatives is a cruel, vindictive choice. They use phrases like unconditional love and family loyalty to excuse toxic behavior. I no longer subscribe to that philosophy. Setting a boundary is not an act of revenge, it is an act of baseline survival. Family should be a reciprocal support system, a network of mutual respect and shared integrity. Family does not mean serving as a financial human shield for someone else's ego. It does not mean absorbing the catastrophic debts of a sibling who refuses to learn accountability. It certainly does not mean sitting in a glass-walled conference room and committing a federal felony just to protect a father who treats your identity as collateral. Thomas weaponized the concept of family to orchestrate a theft. He believed that sharing a surname granted him infinite leverage over my bank account and my future. He learned the hard way that accountability does not care about genetics. When you strip away the emotional manipulation and the childhood guilt, you are left with the cold, undeniable facts of the law. I chose the law, and the law set me free. My name is Amanda Richardson. I am 32 years old, and I am the sole legal owner of my own life. I want to thank you for listening to my story today. I know there are people hearing my voice right now who are sitting at their own metaphorical dining room tables, listening to an unreasonable demand from someone they are supposed to trust. You might be facing a guilt trip, a financial ultimatum, or a coordinated campaign to make you feel like you are the problem, simply because you refuse to pay the ransom. I want you to tell me in the comments below. Have you ever found your freedom in a legal document? Have you ever had to draw a hard line in the sand and let the chips fall exactly where they belong? Share your experience, because someone reading the comments might need the exact courage you found. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I have more stories about uncovering the truth and reclaiming independence waiting for you. Before you go, I want you to remember one vital lesson from that Manhattan conference room. The people who try to exploit you rely on your fear of conflict to get what they want. They depend on you being too intimidated to read the fine print. Never let anyone rush your decisions. Never let anyone dictate your worth. Your future belongs exclusively to you, and true power lies in knowing exactly what your signature is worth. I will see you in the next story. There is a deeply ingrained myth in American culture, one we see painted on holiday greeting cards and broadcast in glowing television commercials. It is the idea that family is the ultimate safety net, the undeniable bedrock of our lives. We are taught from a very young age that blood is thicker than water, and that loyalty to our surname requires infinite grace. But what happens when the safety net is the very thing trying to strangle you? Amanda's journey through extortion fraud and ultimate liberation exposes the fragile underbelly of that cultural myth. We pride ourselves on the American ideals of self-reliance and individual achievement. Yet behind closed doors, countless families operate under a toxic double standard. The responsible child is expected to sacrifice their hard-earned stability to subsidize the reckless choices of the favored one. Amanda was asked to hand over $310,000, the sum of her lifelong discipline, to patch a sinking ship she didn't build. When she refused, the illusion of unconditional love shattered, replaced instantly by character assassination and a coordinated campaign to steal her inheritance. The core lesson here is not just about financial literacy or reading the fine print in a Manhattan boardroom, though those are vital survival skills. The true lesson is about the nature of boundaries. For a long time, we have been conditioned to believe that drawing a hard line with our parents or siblings is an act of hostility. It is framed as selfish or even un-American to turn your back on your kin. But as Amanda sat across from a high-priced corporate lawyer, armed with nothing but certified county documents and her own unbreakable resolve, she proved that setting a boundary is not revenge. It is an act of sheer survival. Family does not mean serving as a human shield for someone else's ego. It does not mean adopting their failures or signing away your sanctuary to cover their crimes. True power in this modern world lies in knowing exactly what your signature is worth and having the profound courage to keep your pen in your pocket when the people you love try to hand you the bill for their mistakes. If you have ever found yourself sitting at a table staring at the people who raised you and wondering if you are the crazy one simply because you finally said no, you are not alone. There is a whole community of people navigating the complex, often painful reality of choosing their own peace over a toxic inheritance. I encourage you to subscribe and follow the channel Elderly Stories. We share narratives just like this one stories that validate your quiet struggles and remind you that walking away is sometimes the most powerful step you can take. In the end, Amanda got her sanctuary. She can sit on the freshly stained cedar dock of her lake house sipping coffee from her grandmother's mug, surrounded by the quiet hum of the upstate New York woods. The air is clean. The bank accounts are secure. The institutional machinery handled the people who tried to break her. Yet, as she looks out over the dark, rippling water of Skaneateles Lake, the silence is heavy. It is the peace of a survivor standing in an empty room. You can rebuild the porch, and you can change the locks to keep the world out. But as the sun dips below the tree line, you are left to wonder, is the space around you finally filled with freedom? Or is it just echoing with the quiet ghosts of the people you had to leave behind?